Thank you. Well, first I'd like to say that I love Muffy and the International Bipolar Foundation. And, you know, one of their greatest gifts to the world was the birthday of Vincent van Gogh, who was one of the foremost people touched with fire. And I think it's perfect that today's day is Touched with Fire. By the way, I think we should make you an honorary member of the People Touched with Fire, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Just your heart underneath the dress and then what the dress is expressing. But I was asked to speak about my story and how the film came about. And I feel like I definitely want to talk about that in terms of, you'll see the common thread being the title of of this event was really the thing that helped me get out of it most and was the challenge in dealing with it most, which was the stigma associated with how we define this thing that you learn you have when you come down from something that was to you beautiful and divine, and you're told that you have this defect. And how are you supposed to thrive and be inspired by that? My own experience, I was at the writing program at NYU studying screenwriting when I graduated, and I went out to LA to get a job with a producer, and that's kind of when the full manic it was like a switch in my brain. It was like a lightning bolt, and I remember it clearly. I was sitting down, and suddenly I looked around, and every object around me, the contemporary meaning of that object vanished, and in their place came flooding layers and layers of timeless, mythic meanings of each object that you see repeated in every mythology and religious book, all pulsing in front of my eyes, and my eyes darted from one to the other, interweaving their meanings, and I was sure that this could be nothing other than a vision of God. You know, I couldn't imagine it could be anything other than that, because I was seeing penetrating beneath every layer of every one of those things. So I went out to into the streets of LA, and thank you. Naturally, that vision became one of the apocalypse, looking around the LA streets. But that led to a complete delusion in which that magnificent story that was so mythical and divine started to take this sharp turn into this apocalyptic vision, which led me to be placed into this basically thought that I was the Antichrist, and there was like this glass case with this like bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. I thought they were going to put me in there, and they were going to like make me sleep with this woman that was going to give birth to the Christ figure, and then they would like kill me and drink my blood, and all this like convergence of all these mythic themes and storylines all kind of converged in that one space. And I took the steel case and I threw it at the glass case in a terror of avoiding that event, and they tackled me and they put me in this place called the Two Towers, where I was with these really deep, imaginative, sensitive souls that were all going through the same thing, and we all spoke the same language, and we all saw everything in this divine light. So like, you know, the egg was the symbol of the cosmos and the symbol of creation, and the one who in this basically like a prison, it's basically like of the criminally insane, they would give the egg to the one who had higher knowledge, you know. And I was in there for about a week, and then I was put into a normal hospital, and after pumping me full of medication, it was like 2 months I came down. After that, like, you know, 60 pounds overweight, they put me into the doctor's office, and they tell me, what happened was there's nothing divine about what you experienced. You have a psychological, neurological defect that's that's basically ingrained into the fabric of your DNA, that has been weaved into the existence of your being by God since the origin of your being. When you're told that's basically what you hear when you say you have a genetic disease. And so all of a sudden, the vision of this divine vision of something I swore I could see was bigger than that, than just narrowing it down to that little description of this genetic defect, was shattered in front of my eyes, and all I had left with was these little broken pieces to pick up, which were my life, and I was expected to be inspired by that and to find a life that was inspiring from that. Now, any description could have been given to me of what I was handed by God now that I was supposed to embark on this journey with. And that's the one I had, you know, and it was when I was walking through the streets, you know, completely disoriented and trying to figure out what I'm going to make of this thing. And every single place I look to find something about this is framed in a medical light, which is defining this thing as a disease. Every website looks like a medical text, medical font, medical this, medical that. Every place I go, all I hear is mental disease, mental illness, you know. And the best that I could hope for was to be pitied. But the human spirit needs more than pity. And the human journey, and I realized, like, at that point, I had no reason to live by good, healthy habits, you know, which are the reason for 10, 20-year reduction in years of your life, you know, because all I could hope for was to get by, and that wasn't enough. And so by the time, you know, I came out of right when I was coming out of the depression, I came across Kay's book, Touched with Fire. And it was a revelation to me because it was the first book that not only didn't look medical, but it looked like a piece of art. And it was a phrase, touched with fire, instead of mental illness, which completely reframed what this thing could be to me, you know, and what I could take from this book to make my life a different journey. And so when people say, well, tell me your story and tell me, you know, what exactly was the thing that made it actually helped you not just survive but thrive in this thing, you know, that was the seed, which then grew from that into a life which was much bigger than surviving. Now, it was a complicated issue. So it wasn't like, okay, now you have this gift, now go, you know, put yourself on fire and go, like, you know, dazzle yourself in the world, you know. I mean, that fire burns, you know, and that fire burns you into ashes. And so the next part of the journey was trying to figure out how to navigate this. So, you know, there was a time when I romanticized it. So what I would do is I would go manic. I would go to these rap clubs and I would be in these rap battles, and they loved what I said because it was just such crazy stuff that I would come up with, you know, it was like, which was all about what they were doing. They were like, how can you come up with a crazier way to destroy someone? And that's how they would bond. And, like, you know, here was me as Luna, and it was a way of flaunting my lunacy, and it was a way of gaining redemption and pride in what I had. But it also led to, you know, tons of marijuana use and you know, staying out late. But it was the best alternative, because the only other alternative was medications that everyone was telling me would make me stable and secure and you know, made me feel like I was supposed to be comforted by the warmth of a straitjacket, you know? And so between the two, I couldn't find anything in between the two. It was that or that, and it was much more inspiring to me to live a destructive life of chaos and misery and bliss, and creating something, potentially creating something in the world that would be inspiring to others. And, you know, so what? You die earlier, but, you know, part of your soul gets to live on, you know. And I had no idea there was anything in between. it was only when I came across, I went into my second depression because of living that, and then I was working at this construction warehouse, and I was sawing a piece of wood, and I was like imagining my hand going through it, and I was thinking to myself over and over again, there's nothing that's going to get better than this, there's nothing that's going to get better than this. I finally resolved to call my father and tell him goodbye, and he panicked, and he came and got me when I was trying to convince him that it was the best alternative for me to die, and he had this terror on his face, and he was like, well, why now? What triggered that? I didn't realize it at the time, but I had I had gone to a website that morning in my usual search for answers, and there was this one website with this one study that was so bleak that tipped it over the edge, the near suicide. You know, it could have been any other website, but that one was the one that was basically telling me there's no hope, you know, and there's nothing other than those two alternatives. Now, I resolved to living on medication just because of the imprint that terrified look on my father's face left in my brain, and it made it so that I basically resolved just getting by. But my health habits were all bad, because I didn't have any hope beyond just getting by. I was basically waiting to die once my parents died, you know? And it was then when I came across Transcendental Meditation, and I started to fight. I started to have a taste of, like, I could be better, I could be creative, I could have a normal life, and then I became fanatic about health habits, you know, everything from drinking wheatgrass to going to bed early to meditation to light box to exercise, with such intensity and a desperation to get out, that by the time I finally got out, I discovered through that I could be more creative than I ever was. And it was only through my own discovery, carrying the seed that was Kay's book, that I was able to really discover that there is something in between. You know, and it's only then that I look back that's when I made the movie. My hope was to put one little thing out there that was an alternative to that website that I saw that morning, or, you know, the medical books, or, you know, something that aligned. That's why it was perfect that it was called Touch with Fire. That was the one other one that I saw. And so when I say that it's the stigma of the thing that is the difference, it's because it's so hard to comprehend what that stigma really is. But the thing is, we're at this cusp in history where people are ready to hear it as being anything. When I did this thing, Gifted with Bipolar, which was a YouTube video for the HuffPost, where I was talking about bipolar as a gift and how I genuinely see that there's this gift in bipolar of creativity and fire. It got 5 million views, and it had like 30,000 to 40,000 comments, which was basically a conversation about, is this crazy or is this legitimate? And most of the comments were positive. So that's proof that out of 5 million views, most of these people were saying, I see how it can be a gift. Now that you're talking about it, the movie, the things, they were ready to hear it. Everyone's ready to hear it, but they don't know what it is. But they're open to finding out what it is. So, you know, my hope is that the next kid who knows they saw something divine, they know it, they could swear it, when they go into that doctor's office, what are they going to be handed? What pamphlet? What phrase? What are they going to be told that they are? Because it'd damn well be something inspiring. Because it's the only way. It can't just be, this isn't inspiring, but this will help you get by. It has to be inspiring. If it's not, they won't get by, and the people in the public won't respect them. They'll pity them. And everyone knows that no one wants to be pitied. That's why they hide in the shadows. you know, what we need now is a new narrative of what this thing is. And it's been done before. In certain cultures, like in certain, these Native American cultures, you're shamans. I mean, they were like, whoa, you're a shaman. I mean, that's like, it's pretty badass. I mean, you know, you'd want to, you know, and in Aristotle called it the inspired state. You know, that they were in touch with this thing that was like, and so it was respected as like a great thing. So it's been done in society before. There's been narratives, you know, which have been a thread, a story that people can follow and be inspired by. And you just imagine watching a movie, and you're watching the difference between watching a movie where you're supposed to empathize with a cancer patient who's dying, and be inspired by that, and everyone's feeling sorry for him. But the cancer patient doesn't just have a disease that's attached onto them that's separate from their being. The disease is their being, in their DNA. And then you imagine like the difference between, and I'm not trying to sound extravagant with this, but these superhero movies where like, you know, this guy falls into a pit of acid and he's mutated and he comes out mutated, and now this is just a story, right? But people form these narratives, they form these stories, and they're like, I was just mutated. I'm gonna come out of this and I'm gonna go save the world, whatever. I have a new gift, I have a new fire in me, you know? These are not impossible things, but it's got to be that everybody aligns to see this thing completely differently. And every website, every pamphlet, every phrase is realigning itself, because maybe our generation can't see it. We might not be able to see it the way that it really could be, but we can at least create it so that the next generation can see it, because they're ready to see it. So that's the biggest thing that I can take out of my journey, the most important thing that I could take out of my journey. I think everything else will follow after that. People want to get treatment. People want to fund research. They'll fund research that doesn't just crush this thing, but finds a way to harness this thing. And, you know, and they'll work with their patients to make sure that they're thriving and not just getting by numb. So anyway, that's my, when I talk about my journey and my movie, that's really kind of what it boils down to. So I encourage you all to think about how we can do that together, you know, as all aligned. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I am absolutely delighted to be speaking with Paul, whom I admire in every conceivable way for how he's carried out his life and his art and his ideas. I'm actually going to be talking somewhat along the lines that Paul was talking, somewhat along the lines of what happened to heroes, what happened to exemplars, what happened for those of us who go mad and have that as a possibility in the rest of our lives. How do we handle it? What do we do with it? And it's the narrative, I think, that Paul's taking, which is you want something to inspire you rather than simply write you off as a psychiatric basket case, okay? So I'm just, oops, great. Story of my life. I just literally got here at the lunch from my publisher, and I just finished a book about the poet Robert Lowell, and some of you will know him, most of you may not. No particular reason in this day and age, I think, sometimes to know somebody in the 20th century, but when Robert Lowell was in his 20s, he wrote a poem called Mr. Edwards and the Spider. It was a book of verse. It was included in a book of verse that won the Pulitzer Prize for him when he was 29. in that poem, Lowell would go on to have 20 manic breaks, more than 20 manic breaks, 20 hospitalizations for mania. In that great poem of his, Mr. Edwards and the Spider, there are the lines, "Your lacerations tell the losing game you play against a sickness past your cure. How will the hands be strong? How will the heart endure?" I first read this poem when I was 17 years old, after my first breakdown when I was a senior in high school. My high school English teacher had obviously noticed something was wrong, though he didn't say to me that he saw that something was wrong. He instead did me the great favor of introducing me to Robert Lowell in 2 of his volumes, Lord Weary's Castle and Life Studies. He gave them to me, and he said that he thought I might like these poems. I can remember exactly where I was when I read these poems, and I realized my English teacher had said he had had problems, and when I read about Robert Lowell, it was clear he had had problems, major episodes of mania. And I can remember where I was when I read them, because I remember thinking, particularly in his great poem, Quaker Graveyard in Nantucket, that I could feel the manic force, as does anyone, I think, who reads that poem. But I could read and feel the constraining will, the discipline of art. And so Robert Lowell's not a poet you go to for how to live your life, or, how to be happy. That wasn't his line of art. But what he was a great artistic genius, and he had guts, and he had discipline, and he admired courage. So what I want to talk a little bit about is courage, and I want to talk about exemplary lives. Robert Lowell was born in 1917. This is the centenary of his birth, and he died in 1977. He was one of those people who died way too young. He was a New Englander, always described as a patrician. He was from a very old New England family. He was the most acclaimed poet of his time, and he was a poet of great striking originality and great striking power. He had virulent manic depressive illness, as it was called then. And as I say, he was hospitalized 20 times. He received ECT psychotherapy. When it came in and was available, the antipsychotic medications, and then was in the very early uses of lithium, to which he responded very well. So what I have been struck by over the years is how little we talk about character in psychiatry and psychology. We just don't talk about it very much anymore. It went out when we started talking about biological psychiatry. And they're not like they're 2 different worlds, but they have actually turned out to be 2 very different worlds. But diseases, and I teach at Johns Hopkins, and William Osler, who was the first physician-in-chief at Hopkins, always said, it's diseases happen to individuals. And it's how individuals deal with the diseases. And I think that that's an enormously important thing, particularly in psychiatric illnesses, which hit so young and which are chronic, which you don't get rid of. They don't just disappear. So I wrote a book about Robert Lowell as a great poet, first and foremost, most importantly, but also as someone who had mania, talked about mania, understood it very well. And I think we don't, again, I think in our field, we don't probably discuss mania. It's a fascinating disorder. It's a fascinating state of being. We tend to focus more on depression. He wrote a great deal about, he certainly got depressed as well, a lot, but he was mainly afflicted by mania. And he wrote a lot about the relationship between that and his art. Robert Lowell's daughter was kind enough to give me access to his psychiatric records and his discussions with his doctors about his mental illness and his poetry and what patterns there were. Studying the River on Fire is a book about fire. It's fire in the blood and darkness. It's about mania and the precarious, deranging altitude to which mania ascends. It's about the poetic imagination and how mania and imagination come together to generate great art. But it is as much and far more about the vital role of discipline, iron hard discipline, and character in making art from inborn gift. Poetry may come from an unhappy and distorted life, Robert Lowell once wrote, but a huge amount of health has to go into the misery. Without question, Lowell's attacks of mania spurred his work. They also brought enormous pain to him and to those he loved. Things that he had done when he was manic haunted him when he was well. They were public, and they gave fodder to his distractors. Yet Lowell came back from madness time and again, re-entered the fray, and kept intact his friendships. He kept his wit and his capacity to love. He went back to his work. And one of the things that's very clear in reading about Lowell or talking to people who were students is that Lowell was a professor at Harvard, and every November or December he would get manic, get deep, very disturbed in the classroom. And students would be waiting for this because they all knew that he had this illness. So they would watch with horror as this person they idolized and actually loved a great deal as a person, and who they absolutely idolized as a poet, would be taken off, sometimes in a straitjacket, to McLean. What people don't talk about so much is the fact that then in January, actually, Lowell would come back and teach. And what goes into that? What goes into showing up after you've been manic? We don't focus on that enough. What goes into those individual acts of courage and determination and discipline? Lowell did this, as he said, 16 times he got up from his knees and got back. My trouble, Lowell wrote to his friend, his great friend, the poet Elizabeth Bishop, is to bring together in me the puritanical iron hand of constraint and the gushes of pure wildness. One can't survive or write without both, but they need to come to terms. It's rather narrow walking. Lowell turned to his own use the warring elements of what one doctor described as his rock crystal will. And throughout his life, it was this contention of this extraordinary will that he had as a child, and studying heroes and studying courage and consciously studying courage, of trying to use that rock will against a completely unbeatable force, namely the mania. No measure of will could prevent mania any more than it could bring down a storm at sea. It was the contending. It was the struggle, the effort that marked Lowell's life and set the terms of his writing and his ambition. A century earlier, Lord Byron, no stranger himself to ungovernable moods, had written, he wrote something that I carried on my on a bracelet for years until I lost it, was Byron's quote, which was, "Yet see, he mastereth himself and makes his torture tributary to his will." So too did Lowell. Mania, the illness which so often struck Lowell, has had a subtle as well as a blunt impact on human history. It has struck those who have founded religions and empires. It has struck those who discovered the laws of nature and mapped new lands. It has set fire to the imaginations of those who write, paint, and compose. It occupies rare real estate in the brain, sharing permeable borders with the normal mind, madness, and imagination. Lowell's had many forces to bring against his mania: his character, his New England heritage, his discipline, his intellect, and his capacity for friendship. Lowell had a severe form of manic depression. He fought to control, fend off, and he turned into writing that over which he had incomplete control. We face the precariousness of keeping alert, of keeping alive in the typical conflict between madness, death, and life, Lowell once said. We must bend, not break. Lowell was dealt a hand of cards high in privilege and poetic imagination, but he also received dark cards, impossible to play, that broke him time and time and time again. There are no rules for how to play such cards. No one is provided a map for how to navigate mania, madness, or depression. I argue that Lowell played his cards with courage and imagination, and above all, he did not fold. It would have been easy to do so. Much of his adult life, he was engaged in a battle against madness or in a fear that the madness would come back. If we see the light at the end of the tunnel, Lowell wrote, it's the light of an oncoming train. So I just want to end with why I turned to Robert Lowell. It's been the great privilege of my intellectual life to be able to be in his company for so many years, I must say. An extraordinary mind. Everyone who knew him thought he was one of the rare geniuses of the time. Complex, metaphorical, brilliant, hard, kind mind. I was interested in Robert Lowell, who he was, how he came to be the man and the poet he was, and why his poetry matters, and what we can learn from his work about the ambition of art, the necessity for art, about courage, suffering, family, about the fragility of sanity, the certainty of death, and the strands that link madness to action and imagination. And in this promising, scrambling, pelting age of neuroscience, I was and remain particularly interested in why character, courage, hard work, discipline, holding to one's true north, matters so deeply in understanding both art and mental illness. I believe that mania and genius can exist together, and do. That suffering can be brought to some good, that the fast swither of mania can fire ambition, steal the nerve, and give high wind to imagination. If checked by discipline, made flesh and blood by experience, doubt, and despair, they can forge great art. They did this in the work of Robert Lowell. Thank you.
Both of you gave a really extraordinary, yes, ma'am. Both of you gave really extraordinary presentations, and I was thinking, as you were giving them, what is more painful, mania or depression? I wonder if you could each really and inexorable. You talked about being unable to resist.
Well, I think the going up, I mean, as you know as well as anyone, I mean, maybe 50% of people who get manic get euphoric, expansive, grandiose highs. And both Paul and I get that version. And that version is not painful. So if you're asked, that part of mania is not painful. When your mind goes completely berserk, and it's terrifying, and you realize you've completely lost your mind, that's a nightmare, but it's a nightmare of a different order because depression is just, it's a very different kind of pain, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely, the hypomania is just bliss. It's interesting, the full mania has extreme pain, but it's like the coin of agony and ecstasy, where there's so much terror, but it's complemented by so much ecstasy that you can even enjoy the terror in a strange way. For me, you know, even in the terrific moments, the haunting moments, there was like an ecstasy to it. And depression is a hell that transcends pain. I remember I used to miss pain when I was depressed, because at least I could feel something. Depression is a undescribable hell, which is definitely far worse than mania for me.
This lunch is clearly about creativity. Paul, Kay, and Muffy. Putting this all together is a very creative work. You refer to lithium, and you also use the phrase blunt impact. I think I have what's called a blunt impact question. I'm curious, what is the state of study, of continuing study about lithium and its effectiveness?
Well, I think lithium is one of those fascinating elements that it's interesting in its own right. It's so deeply beholden to its origins at the beginning of the universe, so that people have studied lithium from almost every branch of science in a funny sort of way. For a long time, of course, lithium was the only really available effective treatment for bipolar illness, and it was used exclusively. And then at some point, because it never was patentable, and the forms of it that were patentable went off patent, that other drugs took over and had huge marketing impacts, never showed the efficacy, the clinical efficacy of lithium. To this day, lithium remains the gold standard. If you look at actual efficacy in terms of stabilizing bipolar illness. More importantly, it has probably 40 or 50 studies now showing a strong anti-suicide effect of lithium. So for many of us who study mood disorders, it is incomprehensible why more doctors don't use lithium. And I know several of us have gone around asking residents when we do grand rounds various places, what do you use? Do you use lithium? Why do you not use lithium? Don't use lithium because it's toxic, because it's difficult to use, because you have to draw blood. I mean, and if you say, well, it works, does that matter? It's an astonishing sort of thing in modern psychiatry that's true. And I think that particularly with suicide, where the evidence gets clearer and clearer, and also with increasingly, though the science isn't as strong, but the science is going in an interesting direction in terms of neuroprotection, in terms of the effects of lithium too. So in terms of reversing effects of cumulative effects of major depression and mania. So they're all very good reasons for it. And the question is, why in psychiatry is it not used much more routinely as the first line of choice? And you've got me. I don't know.
I have a follow-up, Kay. If one would have a vision of acting preemptively in bipolar disorder, we all seem to see its visibility at the age of 10, 12, teen, and it's difficult to treat at that age. But now that we're doing more personalized medicine and learning to do it, what is your vision of how one could act preemptively?
Well, I think preemptively, there are a lot of things. I spend a lot of my time talking on college campuses because of the age of onset. So I spend a lot of time talking to college administrators as well as kids. And I think one of the things, like Paul was saying, people want to know that the illness is understood at some slightly broader level than just this is a genetic defect. I mean, it is true this is a genetic defect, but that is scarcely the most interesting thing for anyone who has it, until you start thinking about having kids, and even then, So I think preemptively you would like to have really good science, so you could, the genetics well enough, or some combination of genetics and neuroimaging, that you could say with a 7-year-old child, this child has this, an 80 to 90% chance of getting this particular variant of bipolar illness that's going to be responsive to, and so forth. So you would like to have the science particularly available in very young children, where you're making decisions that are monumental about whether or not to medicate them or whatever.
Thank you both. My name is Lloyd Setter. I'm a psychiatrist. Thank you both for really all your contributions. Paul, in the film, you tell the story of two young people who have different trajectories. Their illnesses, their lives are not the same. And I wonder if you want to comment about how you understand the variability of this disease in different people, because it is different and there is variability. How do you understand that?
Yeah, that's absolutely true and important what you're saying. In Marco and Carla's case, Marco had a destructive pride with it. And who he was at his core as a character was a very uninhibited loner, just didn't, just had a disregard for what people thought about him. So he was inclined to embrace the identity of a lunatic, and he represented a time in my life, with going to the rap clubs and doing all that stuff. And Carla was someone who was trying to be connected to humanity, felt a need to be connected to humanity, and so she had trouble embracing this identity, and so when they came together, these are two different types of people, but she gave him a sense of connectedness to humanity, and he gave her a pride in the condition. And then their journey was how they were going to, if they were going to embark on that, how they were going to navigate going through those highs and lows together. And I think there are some people who can take to treatment more readily than others, And in Marco's case, he would have the hardest time letting go of mania, which is why, there's a scene in it where Kay Jamison plays herself, and, she's pregnant, and she's, telling him, basically ask KK, can you meet him, and talk some sense into him, and the two of them go in, and people ask me. She had no effect whatsoever. Yeah, she had no effect, and but it literally was you see, she gives the most compelling argument about how you can be creative and you can have bipolar, and then it cuts to they're in the baby's room decorating it, and Marco's saying, she just couldn't ride the tides with Melville and them, and she gave up. She wrote about those artists because she wished she could be like those artists, but she didn't have the guts to be like those artists, so she gave it. And Kay was telling me that was a really great piece of dialogue you wrote, and I was like, I think at some point I probably thought that, and but if there was a Marco in the audience of the movie theater, and that Marco saw the Marco in the film being like, oh, now I get it, Kay. Thank God. I'm going to go take the medication now, and I'll be okay. You know that there'll be that Marco in the audience will be like, Marco couldn't ride the tides. I know I could have, because I'm going to stay true to my art. And then he would live out the tragedy. And so the whole point of having Marco live out the tragedy in the film is so that someone who sees it, who's inclined to do that, hopefully doesn't have to live it out themselves.
Kay and Paul, you're obviously so talented, but you're also really courageous and admirable, and it's wonderful that your creativity enables you to be spokespersons in this way. I have a two-part question. There's much greater interest now, as Dieter was mentioning, and also some controversy about childhood or early onset manifestations of bipolar disorder. So in your situation, Paul, and in your exploration of Robert Lowell's life, were there antecedents in childhood or early adolescence? And then the second part of it, which you may or may not want to speak to, is since the initial sort of definition of what was called manic depressive illness, aka bipolar, the boundaries diagnostically have been broadened to include subcategories like bipolar 2 and also a cyclothymia, and I would be interested in your thoughts about those.
Well, certainly in the case of Robert Lowell, I mean, I think what we know is that people who have a lot of manifestation of illness when they're younger generally go on to have a worse course of illness. And Lowell had very bad disturbances when he was young. I mean, he was very sick and had a lot of problems, saw a psychiatrist very young. He was 15 when he saw a psychiatrist, but he wouldn't have been surprising had he seen somebody much younger. And this is somebody who's from family of Boston Brahmins who probably weren't charging out to see psychiatrists in general. So I would say that. I think the whole thing, I mean, it's a bit of a lost cause in a way. I think nomenclature really counts. And actually, I wrote in one of the appendices of my book, I think manic depressive illness remains a good term. It remains a term that encompasses, of course, recurrent depression as well as bipolar disorders, and that much more accurately reflects what we do and do not know about the cyclicity and the underlying biology of the disorder. I also personally think that bipolar illness is a very truncated, misleading sort of thing. If you've got manic depressive illness, you've got manias, you've got depressions. Bipolar kind of has these there's like a little pull over here that's mania, the little pull over here that's depression, you know, well, not really. I mean, it allows for what you're talking about, which I think is trivializing the illness to some extent, making it way more distributed over a wider population for perhaps very obvious economic reasons. And, you know, I'm probably not doing society that much good by doing that.
I didn't notice any. For me, when I was a child, I didn't notice anything until I was 23 when it happened. The only thing I did have was ADD, you know, which is, you know, I didn't want to focus on boring things in school, you know, which is pretty much it. So it really kind of struck. You know, everyone's different, but for me, it just struck me like by surprise. Yeah, but what aggravated it was I had been on stimulants since I was like 6 or something, first Ritalin, then Adderall. What really stimulated it was around college, you know, there's a staying up late, and then there's a marijuana use. And I didn't know, but at the time, the bipolar brain is actually spurred into a hypomanic state when you smoke marijuana, so that brain experiences extreme creativity and rapid thoughts. And so I was like, all right, this guy wants to watch cartoons and eat Ben & Jerry's, and I want to go write a lot, you know, like all night long. And so maybe we're just different, you know. So I would smoke a lot and write a lot, and I thought I could just keep pushing it and pushing it. And that's really, I think, what put it over the edge. As for the term bipolar, manic depressive, I never knew about bipolar before. I do remember the first time I heard the word bipolar, someone was saying, oh, I heard this person, my mother was telling me when I was in high school, oh, I heard that person's bipolar, and I thought it meant there were 2 personalities. I thought it was like, you know, that movie with Jim Carrey, Me, Myself, and Irene, you know, when the guy's like 1 minute like that, and I was like, oh, I got to avoid that person. So.
I was just informed that we are running a little bit behind schedule, so we have time for one more question, and then our new chair, Susan, is going to get up and say a few words before we all depart.
Paul, this question's for you. I'm over here, the other side. Besides the medication, when you started wanting to live an inspirational life, you mentioned meditation. Can you talk about how TM is helping you?
Yeah, I always say that TM is really the beginning of what I would call the difference between surviving and thriving. Because it's kind of the base core of not only what it does with the studies with brain regenerate, there's all the brain development, but it also sets your mood and your stabilization in place where all the other stuff like the health habits just kind of fall into place after that, because your mind is in such a settled, satisfied state that I remember I was smoking cigarettes before TM, and then I stopped. stopped like a month later, and then that's when I became fanatic about other health habits when I was doing the TM. So it was really like the seed of then all the other stuff grew out of it. And I remember the reason why I did it is because I was working for the David Lynch Foundation doing documentary work with Bob Roth, and we went to a school in San Francisco where we were bringing the TM there, and I came across a guy who said he was doing TM and he had bipolar, and for the last 20 years he was really happy 80% of the time, which I couldn't believe, because I didn't know you could even be happy if you were bipolar, let alone 80% of the time. And I know that people who have bipolar don't take that word lightly, and I could see in his face he definitely was not lying. And that's when I started doing it twice a day.